lovely and moving and spare and, oh, come on, we'll just clap it over. Really well done piece of work. And I think part of what makes it work is so well is that you assume that your audience actually can figure stuff out and can feel stuff without being told what to feel. And can have emotions without having the writer's foot on his or her neck telling you which to have when. Writing about real people is very, very tempting. It's also, for writers, it's also really, really difficult. I remember once when I was writing a biopic, I asked advice of Bill Condon, who's written several. And he said, well, first of all, it helps if they're dead. But whether or not they're dead or living, how do you take a human life which unfolds in one continuous ribbon, but if you're making a film, you got to pick and choose. You got to start somewhere, you got to end somewhere, you got to figure out all of those things to leave out. Max, I think you put your shoulder to this wheel first. What were the first things you knew about how you would tell the story as opposed to what the story was?
I'm good. Well, I think first and foremost, like you said, you need to figure out where you're going to start the story. In fact, the movie makes it appear that it happens in a rather contained time frame, but really it was over 10 years that took place, that story. So the question is, where do you get in? And I think that we felt that we had a place to get out. Obviously, with the death of Dave was a natural exit point. So the question was then, where do you get in? And that became our entry point. Bennett had always imagined that Mark was kind of post-gold medal and pre-really training hard for Soul, which was '88. And that is in fact where John DuPont entered his life. And DuPont had already built a facility and set up the Foxcatcher program, basically kind of a rudimentary version. And so he used Mark as a recruiter. And so that was the entry point. That was the most difficult thing, I think, figuring that out and going from there.
Yeah. And I guess for both of you, because you both worked long and hard on this, the unfolding of the story is very deliberate, respects our intelligence, respects our sensibilities, but like that first slap doesn't come till what I imagine is something like 75 pages into the screenplay, a little more. What gave you both the ambition and the courage to tell the story at the pace it needed to be told, as opposed to hyping up the emotions or making things much more dire, much more soon?
I wrote it that way, and then Dan took everything out. I think that the tone of that story kind of dictated itself, at least for me, and that was one of the hardest things that I worked on at the beginning, was to get the tone and the pacing. And I'm going to let Dan finish this because he did a fantastic job of just reinforcing the elements that were there and then continuing and enhancing them. So
I just wanted to first of all thank Howard for doing this, and also say we did not plan our outfits. But I'm committing you in your choice of checked shirt, blue blazer, and
we did.
Max did work on this first, and one of the most important things for me about this whole thing is that you guys many of you are writers, and you know that in the process of movie making, you rewrite, you get rewritten, and this felt like a really seamless process. Max and Bennett first started talking about the movie in 2007, and talked about what the story was, what it could be, what it should be. Max did a terrific draft and then had to move on to other projects, and my coming into it felt to me like a real continuation of the sort of plowing the path that Max had started. This has felt like a real meeting of minds and a real collaboration, even though we never actually sat together. The pace of it, I mean, I think that there were. I remember talking with Bennett about it, and at a certain point, we would put up cards on the wall. You know, there was a lot of, every time there was another draft, we'd put up all the cards and re-examine it, and it ended up kind of breaking down into something like 6 acts. And I think the first act was called something like my struggle or something like that. And so there felt like there needed to be set periods of time. Mark's need to be rescued by DuPont, and then this kind of honeymoon period where they were together, and then things start to turn in a way that's destructive to Mark, and then the need for Dave, and so it felt like every period of it needed to be deliberately laid out in a way that would move us inexorably towards the end of it. So that felt like the right. I mean, you guys at first worked out that structure, and it felt like the right pace to go for this.
In addition to telling a very personal story with a lot of subtext, mostly about 3 men, there's also a kind of political story going on here too, both in terms of the time period in which it takes place and the references to America, and of course the fact that it centers around the scion of a very iconic American family. In our household in communist Brooklyn, where I grew up, we sang about them. You ready for this? 1, 2. There are 3 brothers named DuPont, and for a price they sell shells that will all armor pierce, and armor that will stop each shell. Which was my uncle and grandfather's way of saying, these people make money off of death. So when you're dealing with both...
that was a scene in the movie, by the way.
Well, it cost too much to clear the rights for the music, I'm sure. Yeah. But when you're telling a story which both exists on the level of a very intimate, small story about some people in a contained space of time, but also wanted to have much larger resonances about who we are as a people, how do you balance those things? How do you integrate them? How do you think about them while you're working?
There were, you can jump in anytime you want. We're talking about the theme, these larger themes of the movie. To me, there was a natural theme of the movie, which comes from Mark's kind of innocent, almost boy-like, unspoiled, pure love of wrestling, America, being a champion. There's something very unspoiled and innocent about him at the beginning, and there's a corruption of that. That's his arc of the movie. That felt like it was very naturally right to be set in the 80s. This was a story that actually spanned many, many years. From, I guess, the 84 Olympics up to 1996 when Dave was actually shot. And it was mushed down into a couple of years' time. And the 80s felt like the right time to express that kind of corruption, in particular by wealth of John DuPont.
One of the things when I started to research on my own, I discovered that the DuPont family made their fortune from gunpowder, which I found to be really interesting, as your family sang about. And that what Dan just said about Mark and him being unspoiled and pure and coming from this other place that DuPont didn't seem to exist have within him, nor his family. I thought that was really interesting. And to add on to that, when Bennett and I, in '07, we started to talk about this, and we discovered DuPont and his fascination with the American Eagle icon, and calling himself Eagle and referring to himself as a patriot. We like that. It felt right that we should touch on that, because it just felt like that's the direction post 9/11 that America was in. But that could have been the complete opposite of what happened. I mean, that might have been a mistake, but sometimes you get lucky, and the zeitgeist just kind of turned and went with that, and it seems very poignant. It seems like we were very clairvoyant 7 or 8 years ago, but that just happened.
Yeah, well, that happens though. When you write well, then you get lucky. One of the things, when you're writing a biopic, with people living, or as Bill Condon prefers, dead, you have a responsibility to the actual folks to render their story accurately, and you also have a responsibility to your audience to tell a story that will take them somewhere, that will quicken their heart, that will make them, if you work really hard and if all of the movie gods allow, make people leave the theater slightly differently than when they came in. How do you balance those obligations? Your obligations to both the very innocent people and the moral monster in this film, but also your obligation, in a kind of much more narrative way, to tell a story, to entertain, to rivet, to keep us completely locked into the story, and to satisfy us in a certain way. How do you make those trade-offs? How do you sell the people down the river for the sake of the story, or bend the story for the sake of respecting the actual people you're writing about?
Well, in this particular case, we had facts. We had the truth, as it were. I mean, John DuPont did in fact shoot Dave Schultz. There's no question about that. I think that ultimately, as you write, you pay a lot of attention to being truthful and honorable to the facts as you know them. And then as the more you write and things begin to peel away, it becomes absolutely necessary that you make the story work in movie terms. You make the people work in movie terms. The dialogue work in movie terms. Everything has to work in movie terms. So you just have to subordinate everything, if you need to get to the place where you can tell the story in a way that engages people and that people find accessible.
I think that's all exactly right, and it's how we approached it. The people we felt primarily responsible to, I think you felt this as well, are the people who were hurt by what happened, and that's Mark and Nancy and her kids. I think Mark ultimately feels well served by this, and I also know that Nancy does as well. Feels like the movie does Dave proud.
Isn't that nice to know?
That
must be an enormous weight off both your shoulders.
It's lovely to know. It was not as Max said, it's not. It can't be your driving concern, but it did. We were trying to deal with all of these characters in a fair and humanizing way. And I also, yes, John DuPont killed Dave. John DuPont had some, however you want to call it, some mental health issues. I think he was eventually diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic, and whatever that means. I think we made an effort to as much as we could, find or express some root reasons for why he might have behaved the way he did. Loneliness, a feeling of inadequacy being primary among them. And so hopefully there's some humanizing of him as well. He died several years ago in prison, so we'll never know what he thought.
One of the things that I really both admire about the work that I just saw and really am moved by is that I think when you're in that screenplay development situation, and I think people in the audience know this as well, when you're dealing with a character who behaves badly, particularly when you're dealing with a character who behaves badly, there's an awful lot of pressure on you to provide explanations. You know, why does he do that? What's his motivation? You know, and I think if you're writing well, sometimes it's much more interesting and much more compelling, not about why they did what they did, but just to examine really, really well that they did what they did. You know, I think of Joan Didion's line in Opening Play As It Lays, you know, what makes Iago evil, some people ask. I never ask. And I think all the things that you said are really evident on the screen, but at the same time, I'm very, again, respectful of and moved by the decisions, both the writerly decisions and the directorial decisions, not to over-explain, not to reduce it to, oh, well, when he was a kid, this happened, so therefore, now that happened. Not to bring in a character like that idiot at the end of Psycho, who takes this, you know, weird-ass and completely inexplicable stuff that you just saw, and then tells you why it all happened. So, I guess...
to get him.
So I guess, were you aware when you were working on it, just how effective it is, how much courage it takes, and how much better it is for the audience if you let us inhabit that rather than explaining it for us?
To answer that, let me give you a little anecdote. Clearly, this is about one of the things is it's about men in singlets.
That was a title that was proposed.
and they're grabbing onto each other, and they're rubbing their bodies against each other, and they're doing all kinds of things with each other. And you know, it came up in discussion. What was DuPont doing in that? Why did he insert himself, if you forgive the pun, into that situation? And was there an ulterior motive? Was this all about some sort of design, homoerotic design, that he could become closer to world-class athletes and somehow become involved with them in some other manner than athletics? And Ben and I talked about this, and we had no evidence from anybody, any interviews that Ben did or anybody that I spoke with, that that's what happened. Although we did find it very strange that DuPont wanted to wrestle with some of these people. And John Jura, who's an executive producer and the wrestling coordinator on this project, I talked to him about this, and I said, he was at Foxcatcher, he was very good friends with Dave, he wrestled for 22 years. And I asked him if, when John DuPont came into the wrestling room, if he wanted to wrestle with you, did you wrestle him? And he said, yeah, sure, we all did. And I said, did you ever feel awkward about it? And he said, well, yeah, it was awkward because DuPont couldn't wrestle. I said, did you ever, I mean, was there ever any feeling of sexual innuendo, touching, anything? He said, no, that DuPont, as bad as he was as a wrestler, was a bad wrestler, and there was nothing more that he ever got from that. But in knowing that, Ben and I and Dan all made a decision. We're just going to let that sit there and let people decide what they want.
Yeah, but I think in so many ways, both of you having decided to let that sit there serves the movie really well. Yeah. I know we have a limited amount of time because there's another film coming in, and I know there are some questions, but let me just ask you one last question if I can. So much of what's expressed in this film is expressed through bodies, is expressed through postures, the way people walk into a room, the way people touch each other, the way people grasp each other, as you said, the way people kind of avoid each other. There's, I think, more acting almost in shoulders than in faces in this film. So how do you write that? Do you just leave room for that to happen? Or what do you put on the page to enable the actors then to do that?
I think a lot. Look, I mean, there are more than three, but primarily three phenomenal performances in this movie. The two women are incredible as well, but these guys inhabit these roles and breathe life into what was, typed on a page in a way that is magical and thrilling for a writer to sit in the theater and watch that happen. There's a lot of tape on these guys. I mean, you've talked about this, but you can go on YouTube, you can see Mark wrestle, you can see Dave wrestle, and then you see these guys, and it is unbelievable. Mark Ruffalo was a high school wrestler, a very good wrestler, but he had to learn how to wrestle lefty. Channing Tatum never wrestled, but is clearly a great athlete and learned how to do this. There are no body doubles in this. Steve Carell, there's a John DuPont documentary that he did make about himself, and I know Steve Carell watched it and studied it, and he jogs around the gym like he did, purposefully. But a lot of that is in the acting. A lot of that is situational. You try to each of these scenes felt to me like in a way a mini wrestling match. So much of it is about power dynamics, who's on top, who's being submissive, who's forcing the other one to submit to their will, and that comes out with great actors in body expression. I don't know if you anything you want to contribute to that, but that's my feeling about it.
No, I just when I saw these guys and what they had done to embody Mark and Dave Schultz, I was just astounded. In fact, if you go on YouTube and you look at Mark and Dave, after the movie you see tonight, you'll see what they've done with those characters. And I saw Mark Schultz last night. For the first time, I talked to him on the phone, but I'd never actually met him in person. And I was introduced to him, and he kind of, would get this huge neck and shoulders, and I looked at him and I thought, hey, you look just like Channing Tatum.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Yes.
First of all, I'm not a writer, but
Can you speak loudly because it's a
yeah,
long.
I'm not a hello. I'm not a writer. And I just want to say, first of all, congratulations. It's absolutely beautiful and sparse and lovely, and reminds me of films from the 70s that you try and, as you said, push emotion on people that they breathe. But my question to you, not being a writer, it's a little bit of what you were asked for the second part is, where does the confidence come from as a writer to know for sure that without a bunch of dialogue that people are going to get it? Is it instinct, or is it from watching films before that have done it and you go, well, okay, they've done it, so we can kind of do it too? But how do you know that what you're doing is going to be doing the same kind of thing, allowing people to fill in, and they're going to fill in what you want them to fill in?
I'm going to make Dan answer that.
See, that's collaboration.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Look, there are two answers to that question. One is you know that your director is really good in the editing room. And so there are some scenes that are longer in the writing and that have been cut down to from 15 lines to 2 lines or 1 line or no lines. And that speaks to the power of the acting. It speaks to Bennett's ability to discern the essence of the scene and distill it into something very small. It also speaks to the fact that we wrote a really fucking long script. And so he had I think the assembly was about 4.5 hours. And so it had to get cut down. So how do you express all of that? But there are scenes that are without dialogue as well. And one of them that is one of my, I love this scene so much. After that beautiful footage that Bennett found of the archival footage at the beginning of the DuPont Foxcatcher Farms, Mark wrestling the leather dummy is one of my favorite scenes, and it's such a crazy, that's written into the script, just that he's wrestling the dummy, and it's such a crazy metaphor for Mark's inability to understand himself, to grapple with himself, to get out of his own way. So it's a mixture of ways that it came down to some dialogue-less scenes.
And I think that's part of the collaboration, which is you wrote something which has all of that weight and all that resonance to it, and then it's shot and acted in a way that it's not ludicrous, it's not campy, it's actually kind of really sad, you know. So again, when I think everybody's pulling in the same direction, it makes the largest difference.
No, question.
Yes.
Congratulations for the bold piece of work, and I'm glad you didn't rush it, because I enjoyed imagining what was going through DuPont's mind. Steve Carell, really interesting choice. At what point was he brought into the project as possible?
For those who couldn't hear, the question ends with, at what point was Steve Carell brought into the project?
Fairly late. It was, this project had initially one financier who either, I don't know what happened, lost their money, got tired of the time it was taking, then there was no money. And then eventually Megan Ellison rode in on a white horse and decided to finance the movie. That was around the same time, it was maybe a year or so before it was started to be shot, that Steve Carell's name came up. And I think what was exciting to Bennett, and I talked to him a lot about this at the time, we were sitting and re-examining the script at the time, and was that it was not somebody who you would expect to do what he eventually does. And that was true of John DuPont, that nobody expected this of him. And that even though he had a munitions factory on his property, he had so many guns, he had bought a tank from the US Army, he would shoot with the local police. Even though he was doing that, nobody expected this, and yet he did it. And so that feeling, there were a lot of other actors that had been talked about but felt dangerous, inherently dangerous, and that would have been a mistake. And Steve, I think has given hints of how great an actor he is, and he really shows it in this movie. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yes.
It's really Dave's story in a lot of ways. I mean, he's the tragic figure. He's the most normal figure, and a person who would be a great kind of audience surrogate. But you didn't really use him as a point of view or a way into the story. Can you tell us what was going on in that story?
Excellent point. Are you a wrestler, by the way?
No.
No. When I got together with Bennett, we talked about what this story was. We had all of this research. He put together just a tremendous amount of articles and hundreds of hours of tapes with wrestlers, and we had this mountain of material. And the question was, how do we tell this story? And I think that we started off really kind of with the idea that this was Mark Schultz's story, and John DuPont was the antagonist. And then as we got going and began to develop, we realized, oh, this is not really working very well. And it wasn't until we introduced Dave really into the story, whether he's in the scene or not. Almost all the scenes are about Dave in some way or another. It's so he informs almost everything that goes on in the script. And in the movie, whether he's in the scene or not, John DuPont and Mark Schultz are vying for Dave's affection, his respect, or something else from Dave. And it was only after we really realized, oh, this is kind of a weird love triangle, that it really reached critical mass, and the tension became great enough to really propel the story forward. And I think Dan can speak to that also.
Yeah, I think it's well said. I mean, I think that this was I think the great breakthrough that Max made. This was a story that Bennett had kind of told. We'd worked together before on a movie, and I'd known Bennett for decades, and he had told me about this thing he was interested in. I didn't quite get it at first, and through their discussions and work together, and through this like notion of Dave has to be present in everything. And then we continued that work, but Dave is on their minds all the time, and certainly Mark's mind, but he becomes an obsession of DuPont's as well. And that three-legged stool is what the movie stands on.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, over there.
There's a few big laughs in the movie, particularly from Steve Carell. Did you expect them?
I expected more. How many times did you laugh?
8?
Yeah, good. No, really, that's good.
Wow.
That's good.
All right.
That's great.
But listen, the movie has a certain tone. It's imbued with a kind of foreboding, I think, that probably undermines some of the more humorous stuff. You get an actor like Steve Carell. I mean, just his ability to turn something and make it funny is there. And Channing also, as brooding and dark as he is, there is an ability to find a little levity in certain things. So it wasn't written as a comedy. So I'm gonna say that some scenes were created that I found humorous just because of the juxtaposition of the characters, and then you put those actors in there, and they kind of brought life to it in a way that was unanticipated, I think, in the script.
Who came up with the word philatelist?
That is, he in his autobiography, that he calls himself a philatelist. Yes, luckily.
All right, they're going to hate us in this theater, but one more question. Yes.
Well, I was really struck by the natural environment of the farm and how that seemed to contribute to the tone and the mood. And I was wondering if that's the way you thought about it. Did you do something to write that in, or was that have more to do with the directing?
I think it's partially in the script, but a lot of Greg Fraser, who's just an incredible cinematographer. A lot of Bennett. I mean, Bennett, this exists in Capote as well. Landscapes, using landscapes to set tone, and they remarkably had to. It was. This is giving away too much. They had to shoot this in Pittsburgh, not in Philadelphia, not outside Philadelphia, and they amazingly made the place look like the main line of Philadelphia, which is where it takes place. That is, I think, a great. There's space for it. There's description of that in the script, but largely that's a creation of Greg Fraser and Bennett.
There's more at the door, so we have to go, but if you'll allow me a brief polemic before we all go. Many people say, and rightly so, that this is the golden age of writing for television, and I think that's an argument that not only can be made, but is really compelling. But I think if you look at the work of Paul Webb and Selma, if you look at the work of Sky Alexander and Larry Karaszewski in Big Eyes, if you look at the work of Bill Nicholson, Richard LaGravenese, Joel Cohn, Ethan Cohn in Unbroken, and particularly if you look at the work that Max and Dan have done here, it's the golden age of another kind of writing too, which is the ability to tell real life stories at the expansiveness they deserve and on a screen the size that the stories merit. And I think for that we should be grateful.